The cold of the forward operating base in the Hindu Kush was the kind that seeped into a man's bones, a damp chill that no amount of layering could fully combat. For the men of SEAL Team 7, it was just another backdrop to the tension that had become their constant companion. They had been in Afghanistan for weeks, running reconnaissance and direct action missions against high-value Taliban targets. The atmosphere in the plywood and burlap hooch they called home was thick with the unspoken language of men who lived on the edge of violence. Jokes were short, laughter was rare, and the weight of the mountain ranges outside seemed to press down on the corrugated tin roof. Chief Petty Officer Marcus "Axe" Johnson sat on the edge of his cot, running a stone across the blade of his Ka bar in long, practiced strokes. The rhythmic shick of steel on stone was a metronome for his thoughts. Across from him, Lieutenant Commander Ray Sullivan was hunched over a topographical map, his finger tracing a wadi that led up to a village they'd been watching for 3 days. The sniper, a lanky Texan named Jonesy, was cleaning the bolt of his Mark 11 with the reverence of a priest handling a relic. They were all waiting. The only man who seemed to exist outside of this heavy bubble of anticipation was the team's medic, Senior Chief Sophia Rossi. She was tucked into a corner, her small tactical light illuminating the pages of a worn paperback. The sight of her, calm and reading, was a source of quiet, bewildered amusement for the team. Here was a woman who, on paper, shouldn't have been there. She was Navy, but she ran with the SEALs. She was a healer. But she carried an M4 with the familiarity of a seasoned infantryman. Axe had seen her in the kill house during workups. She moved with a fluid precision that made him think she'd been born with a rifle in her hands. But she never talked about it. Any question about her past was met with a polite, stone-walled deflection. Axe stopped sharpening his knife and nodded towards her. "Hey, Doc, what's the book?" Sophia looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the dim light. She held up the cover, revealing a battered copy of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. "Just getting lost somewhere else for a while," she said, her voice soft but clear. It was a voice that commanded attention without demanding it, a calm in the center of their storm. Jonesy snorted from his corner. "Lost is right. I can barely read the op order without my eyes crossing, and she's tackling magical realism." Sophia offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It's about family, history, the way things repeat themselves." She looked down at the page. "Not that different from what we do." Sully looked up from his map, his brow furrowed. "You find magic in the mountains here, Doc? Because all I see is rocks and places for Haji to hide." Sophia's smile faded, replaced by that familiar, distant look. "No magic here, Commander. Just reality." She closed the book, marking her page. The conversation died, and the silence returned, thicker than before. Axe watched her for a moment longer. There was a weight to her, a gravity that went beyond the 60 pounds of kit on her back. He'd seen it in combat vets, the ones who'd been to the well too many times. But Sophia was just a doc, or so he thought. The mission came down at 0200. An Afghan National Army patrol had been ambushed in a village 3 clicks to the east. They were pinned down, taking heavy fire from a reinforced compound. The SEALs were the closest QRF. In less than 10 minutes, the hooch was a blur of controlled chaos. Nods were mounted, mags were checked one last time, and the team moved as a single organism towards the waiting MH-60 Blackhawks. In the bird, the wind roared through the open side doors, carrying the frigid air and the thumping rhythm of the rotors. The men were silent, each lost in their pre-combat ritual. Axe sat across from Sophia. Her helmet was on, her nods flipped up, and her face was illuminated by the ghostly green glow of the cabin lights. She was checking her medical bags, her hands moving with a speed and certainty that was mesmerizing. She had pouches for hemostatic gauze, for chest seals, for needle decompressions. Her world was a universe of tourniquets and trauma shears, a world she navigated better than anyone Axe had ever seen. As the Black Hawk flared for landing, kicking up a tornado of dust and small rocks, the first sound of gunfire crackled through the radio. Small arms, then the heavier thump of an RPG. The bird touched down for barely a second, and the seals were off, a black wave pouring into the moonless night. Sophia was right behind Axe, her boots hitting the rocky soil with a certainty that surprised him. The village was a maze of mud-walled compounds and narrow alleyways. The firefight was intense. Tracer rounds burned through the air, creating red and green arcs of death. And the seals moved with terrifying efficiency, bounding from cover to cover, suppressing enemy positions. They found the ANA patrol huddled behind a low wall, 2 of them down, their cries for help piercing the roar of the guns. Sully's voice was a calm rasp in their ears. "Axe Jonesy, suppress the second-story window. Doc, we need you on the wounded. We'll cover you." Axe and Jonesy opened up, their fire chewing into the mud-brick wall, forcing the Taliban fighters to duck. Sophia didn't hesitate. She sprinted across the open kill zone, a low crouch that made her a difficult target. She slid on her knees into the dirt next to the first wounded soldier, a young ANA private with a sucking chest wound. His breaths were shallow, each one a gurgling struggle. "Easy, easy," Sophia murmured, her hands already working. She ripped open his uniform, revealing the small, ugly hole in his chest. The sound of air escaping from the wound was unmistakable. In one fluid motion, she pulled a chest seal from her kit, wiped the blood away, and slapped it over the wound, taping it down on 3 sides to create a one-way valve. "This will help you breathe, brother. Stay with me." The other ANA soldier was worse. His left leg was a mangled mess, severed below the knee, a femoral artery hit. Blood was pulsing out in a dark, rhythmic fountain. A tourniquet had been applied high on his thigh, but it was a field-expedient mess, a strip of cloth and a stick, and it was failing. The soldier's face was ghostly white, his eyes rolling back in his head. He was bleeding out, right there in Sophia's hands. The gunfire intensified. Sully and the others were in a full-on firefight, the air crackling with the sound of M4s and AKs. Axe, from his position, risked a glance back. He saw Sophia, crouched in the open, utterly exposed. He saw her look at the failing tourniquet. He saw her look at the soldier's ashen face. And then he saw her do something that, for a split second, made no sense. She put her hands on the wound, directly on the spurting artery, and applied pressure. It was a futile gesture. You can't stop arterial bleed with finger pressure alone. You need a tourniquet. You need hemostatic agents. You need a miracle. But then she moved. She ripped the field tourniquet off. She grabbed the soldier's own belt, looped it around the stump of his leg, high, high up in the groin crease, where the femoral artery runs closest to the surface. She pulled it with a strength that seemed impossible for her frame, twisting the leather with a combat knife until it was agonizingly tight. It was a desperate last-ditch maneuver, a technique Axe had only ever heard whispered about from old-school Vietnam vets. It was a trauma bypass, a direct compression of the artery against the pelvic bone. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. Sophia didn't pause for celebration. She pulled a needle decompression kit from her vest. She found the spot on the soldier's chest, the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She muttered a prayer or a curse, Axe couldn't tell which, and plunged the long, thick needle into the soldier's chest. There was a hiss of released air as a tension pneumothorax was relieved. The soldier's chest, which had been still, began to rise and fall in shallow, ragged breaths. In less than 60 seconds, she had performed 2 of the most advanced, most harrowing trauma procedures known to combat medicine, all while rounds cracked and thudded into the dirt around her. It wasn't just skill, it was something else. It was a cold, profound mastery, a knowledge that seemed etched into her bones. The enemy fire finally slackened as a well-placed grenade from Jonesy silenced the second-story window. The team moved up, securing the compound. The call went out for the medevac. As the dust settled, the immediate crisis passed. Axe walked over to where Sophia was now stabilizing the two soldiers, her hands covered in blood up to her elbows. The other SEALs gathered, forming a protective circle. They had all seen it. They had all seen the impossible. Sully stared at the leg, at the crude but effective tourniquet. "Jesus Christ, Rossi," he breathed, his voice stripped of all command authority. It was just a man, awed by what he had witnessed. "Where the hell did you learn to do that?" Sophia didn't answer. She was focused, checking the soldier's pupils, his pulse. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Axe knelt down beside her, his voice low. "Doc, that move with the belt, that's not in any field manual. I've never seen anyone pull that off." For a long moment, she didn't look up. When she finally did, her eyes were not the calm, professional eyes of the Navy medic they knew. They were ancient eyes, full of a sorrow that seemed to predate her years. She looked at the circle of men, the baddest operators on the planet, and she saw the question in all of them. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and the first sign of any human weakness they had ever seen in her. "You want to know where I learned that?" she asked, her voice a rasp. She reached into the collar of her combat shirt and pulled out a thin, worn chain. Dangling from it was a set of dog tags. But they weren't Navy issue. They were the old, tarnished, rectangular kind, the kind worn by a different generation. She held them out, letting them swing in the pale moonlight. Axe leaned in, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He could make out the name stamped into the metal. Rossi, DR U.S. Marine Corps, Vietnam. Axe's breath caught in his throat. He looked from the tags to Sophia's face, seeing her in a completely new light. "Your father?" Sophia shook her head, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime and blood on her cheek. "My grandfather, Marine Force Recon, Sekasan." She clutched the tags in her fist, her knuckles white. "He taught me that tourniquet trick when I was 12 years old. He said, 'Sophia, in a fight you don't always have the fancy gear. Sometimes all you have is your belt and your nerve. That's what separates the ones who live from the ones who die.'" She let the tags fall back against her chest, tucking them away. She looked at the wounded soldier, now stable and waiting for the chopper. "He taught me everything: anatomy, pressure points, how to find the femoral in the dark, how to pack a wound. He said the Corps taught him to be a killer, but the war taught him to be a healer. He came home from Vietnam with 2 silver stars, a prosthetic leg, and a head full of ghosts. He spent the rest of his life trying to save what was left of himself. He taught me so I could finish what he started." The story tumbled out of her then, not as a monologue, but as a confession, pulled from her by the gravity of the moment and the unspoken bond of the brotherhood surrounding her. She spoke of her grandfather, Don Rossi, a man who had lied about his age to get into the Marines, who had fought in the hell of the Vietnam jungle, who had watched his friends die in his arms. She spoke of his Purple Hearts, his bravery, and his silence. He never talked about the war, not the big things, but he taught her the small things in the garage of their New Jersey home, using old first aid manuals and anatomical charts. He taught her how to tie knots, how to set a bone, how to see the human body not as a mystery but as a machine that could be fixed. She spoke of how his trauma became her trauma. The night terrors she would calm him from as a teenager, the way he would inspect the perimeter of his own house, the guilt he carried for surviving. She joined the Navy to become a corpsman, to serve the Marines he loved, to understand the world that had made and unmade him. She pushed for BUD/S for the SEAL teams because she knew that was where the fighting would be, where the wounds would be the worst, where she would be needed most. She wasn't just serving her country, she was serving his ghost. She was trying to save the men he couldn't. She recounted the day he died 5 years ago. She was on her first deployment in Iraq. She got the news in an email, heart attack. They said it was his heart, but she knew it was the war. It had finally caught up with him. She had worn his tags ever since. The medevac Black Hawk thundered in, and its rotors whipping the dust into a frenzy. Sophia and the team helped load the wounded soldiers. As the bird lifted off, taking the 2 ANA soldiers to the field hospital in Bagram, the SEALs stood in the sudden, profound silence. They were covered in dirt, sweat, and the smell of cordite. But it wasn't the firefight that had left them speechless. It was the story. It was the revelation that for the past 6 months, they had been operating alongside not just a brilliant medic, but a living, breathing memorial. A woman who carried the weight of a war she never fought. A legacy of trauma and heroism stamped on a piece of metal around her neck. They walked back to the rally point in silence. No one joked. No one debriefed. Axe walked beside Sophia. He didn't know what to say. Words seemed pathetically inadequate. Finally, he just looked at her and gave a single sharp nod. It was a gesture of respect, the kind one warrior gives another. It said, "I see you. I see the weight you carry, and I am honored to stand beside you." Sophia met his eyes. The professional mask was back in place, but underneath it, there was a flicker of something else. Gratitude, maybe. Or just the simple human relief of no longer having to carry the burden alone. She nodded back, once. As the first hints of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of gray and pink, the SEAL team moved out, ghosts in the growing light. They were heading back to base, back to the world of cots and MREs. But nothing would be the same. They had seen into the soul of their medic, and they had found a battlefield far older and more scarred than the one they had just fought on. And the injured soldier was wordless, saved by a technique from a war long past. And every SEAL present stood frozen, not by the violence they had just survived, but by the haunting, beautiful, and tragic history that had been uncovered in the middle of it all. The line between healer and warrior, past and present, had been permanently blurred, and they would carry the image of Sophia Rossi, clutching her grandfather's dog tags in the blood-soaked dust, with them for the rest of their lives.